Hi, my name is Marian. This presentation is called Logging and Collecting Metrics to Ease the Pain, and that's what we're going to talk about. Basically, what the logging is, how to do it, etc. So, a little bit about me. I have graduated from the University of Warsaw last year with a master's degree in computer science, and currently I am working at Microsoft in Ireland, working on a project that in a way encourages enterprises to keep their office installations up to date. So as part of this project, we're running a service that's expected to take traffic from a few 100 million devices. And when you're running on such a global scale, you need a high performance services and such. Whenever there's issues, you need to be able to diagnose them quickly and without too much trouble. So it's not uncommon to have a logging statement every few lines of code, and just make sure everything is being tracked and can be acted upon. Right, so what are the problems that logging can solve? Basically, you want to be able to say what the app is doing in a given moment. Locally, you can do that with a debugger by attaching and then breaking and inspecting the state of the application. But usually the production environment is remote, so it might be complicated to do that there. And moreover, you wouldn't want to do it anyway because debugging requires the application to stop. And in production, you want it to be running all the time to serve your customers. And moreover, in my case, if I want to get close to the production environment, I need to get a permission approval from someone on my team and provide a valid reason why I need to do that. So again, usually you don't really have direct access to the production environment, so you need to be able to remotely debug it by viewing the logs. And again, you are just collecting the logs all the time, and also when you sleep. So some errors are hard to reproduce locally because they just don't happen very often. So you're sleeping, there's an error in the service, come up to work in the morning, open the logs and see, okay, there was an error. How did it happen? Okay, let's try to reconstruct this situation locally, and maybe I can actually cause the exception, and we can get on and try to fix it. Then in other scenarios, you have a distributed setup where you have a few different services running and you have a workflow which spans a few different services. So you would create a correlation token, which allows you to say, okay, the workflow starts here in this service, but then the service makes a request here and it passes the correlation token. So then you can make a continuous list of steps that it took to complete this workflow. And moreover, you get some analytics opportunities to say, for example, okay, so this piece of code, only 20% of users hit it. So we can decide that maybe another part of the code which just hit more often needs to be more optimized or something like this. Right, so we know why we need to debug, because we need some insights. But how? What should I log? You want to be able to kind of substitute the debugging process that you would have locally with the logs, you wouldn't go and log every step of the way, each variable, each state, the application changes, etc. You only want to log what matters. And how do you know if it matters? Well, you will get there with some experience by writing logs and then working with them to debug. So you will find out that, okay, for example, these are the important parts. So here I have a few different steps that we can look at. So for example, you start logging when the work starts. For web services, this can be a request that comes in, you log the URL, some parameters, the handler which takes care of this request, etc. For some other types of services, you might be working with a message queue. So an event comes in, again, you log the type of event and how it is handled. Then for each step of the workflow, either before or after it, you want a logging statement. And when I say step of the workflow, I mean some bigger step, something that potentially you want to know the state of, or you want to know that happened. And why you want to know that it happened? Well, so as you look at the logs, if there was an error, at some point the informative logs will end suddenly. And okay, you know how far the workflow got before it got an exception. And if it does get an exception, well, make sure you log it, because there's nothing worse than a silently suppressed exception. Even if you're handling it, it's good to say, yes, it is an expected exception. I'm logging it, and then I'm handling it. Right, and then the work finishes, right? And you say, yeah, it was a success or it was an error. For web requests, again, you would have like the HTTP status code. You also might have some duration of the workflow, how long it took to complete. So we log that as well. Okay, so now the format of the logs. Well, initially, logs were just strings, outputted to the standard output or standard error or a text file, whatever. The point is, first it was just text. Then it was structured text. So you had at the beginning the timestamp, then you had some log level, and then you had the message. And this is great for most of the things you want from logs. But the more advanced your work is when it comes to working with logs, the more you want to have the flexibility to perform complicated queries on the logs. And working with simple text logs is not very flexible, because you often need to write more and more complicated regular expressions to parse the logs and give you the information you need. So instead, many systems offer structured logging, where you put your log in a structure, right? A predefined schema that describes, even often with types, what different pieces of data you're given it. And this allows you to write more complicated and possibly more efficient queries. But at the same time, it kind of introduces again the complexity in that it's no longer just a text file that you open with a text editor. It's now a system which has a database, for example, to store those logs. So yeah, it's again a trade-off. Now let's take a look at the metadata part of a log record or a log entry. In the first place, there I have a unique tag. So this is actually pretty cool. Each logging statement can have a unique tag in the system. And this is something by which you will then be able to have a mapping between the code and the logs, right? Say you're looking at the code and wonder, how many users hit this code path? Okay, let's take the tag, put it in the log system, boom, you have the numbers. And vice versa, you're looking at the logs and wonder, okay, well, there's an issue here. Where is it in the code? Okay, boom, and there you're in the code. Okay, next one is the category. This could be like a name of the module, like a class, etc. I'm not using it very often, but it can be useful in certain contexts. Okay, next is the environment. So you can say that, okay, these logs are in pre-production, production, etc. They may be in certain regions, like you're deploying to US, Europe, Asia, etc., to have your application more available in different regions or available more quickly. You can have the build version, right? Which, if you're running, for example, rolling updates on your services, you can then know when the update happens. And if you fixed an error, a bug, and you can then map that, okay, if it happens again after you fixed it, can I validate, yeah, it's still the old version running it. Let's wait for the update to make sure it's fixed properly. And then you'd have some custom context. So this can be the correlation ID I talked about that maps the workflow to different services. It can be a user ID, some custom setting, something that your application uses to enhance the logs, to allow filtering on it. And with the schemas, you can have a fixed schema, which says every log entry is the same. Or you can have a flexible schema, which says most log statements look like this, but you can put some additional properties when you need them. They're again more flexible, but are slightly less efficient potentially, right? Because with a fixed one, you just have a database with fixed schema. And the flexible one is probably a little more complicated. Right, so here I have an example of a custom query, which is fairly similar to one I have used at work to correlate an exception, and in my case it was a task cancel exception with the duration of the request. So I was able to say that, yeah, for the most part, the task is cancelled whenever their request takes a long time. Well, makes sense, right? But there was a few cases where the request was actually very short. And this means that there was a bug there, which has cancelled the request prematurely when it shouldn't have. So we had to investigate further. Okay, so these were the logs, and now the metrics. The metrics are a special kind of logs. So the logs focus on the step-by-step of a workflow, right? To allow you this debugging power. Whereas the metrics focus more on the certain parameters, the properties of the system, like how long it takes to run a given piece of workflow, how many times it succeeds, how many times there's errors, etc. These things are usually not stored sequentially, because you don't really care if now the request took 10 milliseconds and the next one took 100, and the next one just again took 10, because within like milliseconds it doesn't really matter. You usually have the metrics aggregated within a time period. So we can then say, okay, within a minute, the minimum, the maximum, the average duration was that and that. And then you can zoom out and say, okay, well, across the week, we have deployed on Wednesday, and the average duration fell down, which means we have optimized our system in some way and it works. So yeah, you want to describe the health and the performance of your system. This can be different depending on what your system is, you know. So yeah, another example I have is tracking the rollout of updates. So you can have a metric that is enhanced again with some additional metadata. Like, for example, the version of the application that the user is running to access your services. And so if you update the application, you can then follow the metric by seeing like percentages of how many users are still on that version and on the new one, etc. Right, so because the metrics describe when your system is healthy, you can then say, okay, what is unhealthy? And you can say, the metrics describe the health in general, right? So you can then say, what is unhealthy? So you can say that, okay, maybe the response time fell below a certain threshold for the 90th percentile of users. Or you can say, okay, well, there's above a certain threshold of errors happening within 10 minutes. Or you can say, we know that each hour there's supposed to be at least that many events processed, and they weren't. So this is what we say, that the system is unhealthy and there's an issue. There's an issue, you should be notified, right? You get an email, you get a text, whatever. But something that brings you to attention that there's an issue, and you can investigate it and potentially fix it using the more details that are included in the logs. Okay, so all of this logging infrastructure, it's supposed to make it easier for you to find errors and also make decisions about the direction of development or business decisions. Here on the slide, you can see a potential source of frustration, a 1-star review with not much explanation about why something didn't work. Like, what did the user do? So if you have the logs, you can find those errors and you can say, okay, this was transient. The user was unlucky and this one time the database failed. And they didn't retry, so they were angry and put a review like this. Or maybe you just look at the errors and see, okay, there is an issue, but we haven't had any complaints yet, so we can fix it and customers would be happy, and they didn't maybe even know. Right, so I've already have provided a few examples when the logging and metrics are useful. So let's take a look at a few more. One case was that we had written tests, right? The system was green, it was working, and it was working fine. But then someone just was like, okay, let's see, what are the errors coming up? And they found out that 2 times per hour, more or less, we were getting an exception. So then we have spent some time going through the logs, saying, oh, well, why would it be happening? It shouldn't be happening, etc. But finally, we were able to say, okay, well, I think there's something similar between those exceptions. I was able to extract the batch size of the operations we are doing from the logs. And then it became clear, because every time we got an exception, it was when we were processing a batch of at least 50 items. This let us know what the issue was in general. And then because we were working the system, we knew like what the likely cause was. And yeah, it turned out that it was fairly easy to fix. Okay, so again, the service might be working perfectly, but then there's UX. And it can fail as well, you know. The customer sees a red banner that says error. It's not great. So it's also important to have logs in the UX and to be able to view them and later fix it. Okay, and then we have the infrastructure metrics. So it's not only the application that's making metrics, right, based on the work it's doing. It's also everything around it. So the database usage, the CPU usage on the server, maybe load balancer performance, or the messaging queue, number of items it's handling, etc. All of this can be used to make sure that your service is running healthy. In our case, we were still running healthy, but it turned out that there was a subtle bug introduced in how we were making queries to the database because we have changed how we are constructing the parameters when sending them to the ORM. And this caused a visible, on the graph, a visible jump in the database usage, right? If we didn't have the metric for that, we wouldn't have noticed it, and we maybe would have noticed later when it actually became a bigger issue. Right, and the last scenario here on the slide is I have a feature working locally. It's mocked perfectly, right? But then in the production environment, it turns out that the API, the external API that we're calling, is not exactly returning us what we're expecting. So I had to put in some logs to see, okay, what is it returning? Like, what can we see there? I added some gates that said, okay, well, let's for now not do anything, just see what's happening from the API. And yeah, after that, we can modify the feature properly to correspond to what is in the production, you know? Right, so web services are great, but it's also good to look into some slightly more interesting areas, like, for example, games. So the first one is this scenario where a bug happens, but it happens very rarely. And games are usually complicated in that you might be able to play the game a bunch of times and never hit the bug. So it's important when the bug happens that you have recorded like the steps that the player took each way, when they were playing, and then you can replay those steps in your local environment to say, okay, now the bug happens, and then you can attempt to fix it properly. It's interesting also to gather many metrics about the levels and the different behaviors of the users. So one of the things is like how hard the level is. And you can measure it in a few different ways. For example, how long it takes for the user to complete the level. How long does it take for them to die? How far they get before they die, etc. And achievements. Well, this is again a type of metric, which is both at the user level, how the user plays, how far they've gone in the game, and also for the developer, it's saying, okay, well, this many users have gone through this point, etc. And well, in the more complicated scenarios like massive multiplayer online games, you might be having some character or a few characters that the users can choose from, and you generally want the power level of those characters to be similar, so that it's more about the player's skill rather than the character's power. So you would you check the statistics of successes and failures of how the players use those characters to make them stronger or weaker depending on the scenario. Right, so finally, let's talk about the last part. Well, it's the storage and analytics. I've done a few looks on the internet. What can you use really? Because at Microsoft we have like a custom system for this, but in general I try to take a look at some open source options. So there's Greylogs for logs, which can then use something like MongoDB, for example, as a backend for storage. And for metrics, you have some time series optimized databases like InfluxDB or Graphite, and then you would use some special connector to send the metrics there. So again, I work in .NET mostly, so for .NET there's AppMetrics library which allows you to connect to such a database and send those metrics. But also I'm thinking that the next time I'm working on a project, possibly a game, I'm actually going to give Application Insights a try. It's a feature of the Azure Monitor, which combines the logs, the metrics, gives you some visualizations as well. It works in the cloud and it's decently priced. So yeah, and it's used the Custo query language, which I'm using at work, which is like a really nice language for writing log queries. I really like it. But yeah, there's of course many more solutions for logging and metrics collection out there, so you should probably look at other options as well, to make an informed decision. And yeah, that's it for me. Thanks so much for watching the presentation. If you have any questions, you can hit me up on Twitter, send me an email. You can check out my previous presentations on my YouTube channel. And well, may logs and metrics ease your pain as well. Bye.